Hey. Hey. So, Mr. Strohmeyer has given me permission to steal 11 minutes of your time. This piece doesn't have a name. If I had to give it one, I'd call it Fuck Templeton. When I returned to Korea for the second time, in February of 2008, I refused the apartment that had been secured for me. It was conveniently located and spacious enough, but the kitchen had not a lick of counter space, a gaping hole in the wall, and was set up in such an awkward way that a full-size fridge was out of the question. Now that I wasn't a newbie, I was fully aware that the time and money that had already been invested in my hiring process gave me some negotiating power. So I marched into the office of my kindergarten's Wanjang Nim, and I sweetly demanded in very slow, broken English that I be allowed to find my own apartment. Kitchen ang 좋아요. Me need cooking. Better kitchen, I cook you dinner. Better kitchen, I better 선생님. I was fortunate to have a friend who had enough real estate vocabulary to help me navigate the local Busan songs, and within a week, I was escorted into the perfect apartment in Samik Beachy Baeksamdong. A huge 2-bedroom with a lovely balcony-esque area and bright modern kitchen that I knew I could do some serious culinary damage in. It took me almost a full year to build my apartment into a home. I cooked my face off at least 4 nights a week, a hobby that, given my generosity and penchant for expensive imported ingredients, I attribute my lack of savings to. About 9 months into my second contract at the kindy, I started to hear the pitter-patter of little feet romping around and scratching in the corner above my couch. I assumed that my upstairs neighbors had gotten one of those poofy little dogs, or a pet bunny. When I half-heartedly complained to my friend Nuala, with whom I had a standing Monday home-cooked meal and a legally downloaded movie night at my place, she cocked her head and listened. Jen, you're aware that there's a large space, for pipes and shit between your ceiling and the flat above? My brow furrowed, as I realized this was one of those times when my level of common sense just didn't match up with my level of intelligence. Nuala continued, "That's not a puppy, you've got a rat." That night, I did a quick visual inventory of every corner of my apartment, noting that the only access to the crawl space above was a small pop-out vent in my bathroom. And then I saw it, the gaping hole, the obvious result of water damage about the size of an 8-year-old's head, on top of my kitchen cabinet above my stove. Now, most people would have immediately plugged up that hole, but in light of my aforementioned common sense deficiencies, I came to the conclusion that since I had only heard the noises above the opposite side of the large room, this rat, and yes, at the time I believed there to be one rat, must not be capable of navigating the 25 feet between my living room and my kitchen. And for a while, this logic prevailed. But soon, my furry little flatmate seemed to be having dinner parties of his own. A few weeks later, on a Monday, I stood at my stove, sporting my gingham apron. As I trolled my wooden spoon through a big pot of what was perhaps the best chili I had ever made, Nuala sat on my couch trolling Metacritic for our evening's entertainment. "So, how's your rat?" I shrugged. "I hear them, but I've never seen one, so." And, as if on cue, a fat, nasty little face appeared directly above my head, sniffing enthusiastically at the wafting aroma of beans and ground beef and beer and onions and chipotle. I screamed, and Nuala cruised to my side, joining in my fit as Homeboy boldly inched out of the hole, looking like he was about to dive bomb into my scrumptious meal. "Cover my fucking chili!" I screamed, while I ran to the closet and grabbed the broom. Some dancing around, shouting and jabbing scared the rat back into its lair. I found a pair of old sweatpants and used the broom handle to plug up the hole. We resumed our evening, which was laced with the brand of nervous laughter that often follows a narrow escape from disaster. And that chili was damn good. The next day, I reported the incident to my supervisor at work. "So, you have mouse?" "No, not mouse, it is rat. Big, scary, dirty, dangerous mouse. Ooh, aish. My landlord was called, and her response was something along the lines of, tough shit, tell her to call an exterminator. In the meantime, my boss was going to send the bus driver / accountant / handyman from my hagwon home with me at break time to properly cover up the hole. I met him in the lobby of my school at break time to find him holding 3 sheets of 11 by 14 construction paper and a roll of Scotch tape. I shook my head, spun on my heels, went back upstairs, and used my break time to conjure up a witty Facebook status that involved chili and fur and hole plugging. I met the exterminator at my place the next day during my lunch break. The young, handsome guy donned a few glue traps and a bag of mouse poison. I pointed out the vent in the bathroom and the hole in the ceiling, and he scratched his head. I could tell it was more than just a language barrier I was dealing with. I was fairly certain that my knight in shining arsenic was, well, a little dim. He stood on a chair that I had provided and popped out the square of my bathroom ceiling. He glanced nervously at me as he readied his flashlight in one hand and a trap in the other. I couldn't possibly imagine putting my own unprotected head into that hole. Wait, I yelled. I ran into the other room and reappeared with my motorcycle helmet. He nodded, his shame overshadowed by his relief, and he put it on. I really wanted to go get my camera, but I restrained myself. I returned home that afternoon to a quiet apartment and settled in for a 30 Rock marathon on my couch. About 10 minutes into the first episode, the noise started. It was as if, now that they knew that I knew they were there, they had no reason to tiptoe around. It sounded as if an entire rat colony were having relay races. I thought maybe they were having their annual sports day. Or perhaps they were gathering their forces, and the loud, squeaky chatter that accompanied the running and sliding and pouncing spread a message along the lines of, "The British are coming, the British are coming." Whatever the case, these sounds were so loud and hideous that after a few minutes of listening, dumbfounded and covered in goosebumps, I gathered my things and went to sleep at Nula's. When I returned home from work the next day, my plan was to do a quick load of laundry and tidy up. My friend Jason from home was coming to Busan for a work conference and would be staying at my apartment. I had forewarned him about my situation, and he had told me that after having a house full of mice in New Orleans, he was willing to man up and help me deal with it. My washing machine, which also served as my hamper, was already full of my dirty clothes. I opened the lid and then slammed it shut just as quickly as I saw a long, slick tail slither beneath my favorite hoodie. Yeah. I called Nula, who had become just as invested in the exorcism as I was, and then excitedly dialed the exterminator. Nula and I perched on the couch, listening to the low thumping sounds that emanated from my washing machine, half disgusted and half stoked that we finally had one trapped. When my half-wit hero arrived, he bent over the lid of the washing machine and with a baton extracted each pair of my dirty underwear with trembling hands. Nula and I did what any mature 35-year-old woman would have done. Stood behind the poor schmo, dong shimming the air behind his ass. After it had been established that the rat must have escaped through the water tube, a new artillery of traps were laid, and 3 bags of poison were chucked up into the crawl space and in the corner between my fridge and washing machine. This time, we decided to use peanut butter and bacon as bait. Jason arrived, but he was barely around, as his schedule was jam-packed with meetings. The following 36 hours went something like this. I would arrive home to a steady clacking of plastic against wood, accompanied by pervasive high-pitched shrieks. I would call the exterminator and wait for him with an increasingly heavy conscience. As much as I wanted the rats out, the animal lover in me could not fully escape the guilt of the torturous fates I had bestowed on these living, breathing creatures. On the night of American Thanksgiving, I went to a friend's house with a dish that I had prepped with no pleasure whatsoever on my living room coffee table. When I returned home at about midnight, Jason was already passed out in the spare bedroom. That night, his Korean clients had properly introduced him to soju. Yet another rat had been caught in the vent above my bathroom. This one was apparently experiencing a whole new level of agony. After Skyping a sympathetic aunt and bellowing to her about my rodent woes, I knocked myself out with a sleeping pill. The next morning, I was awoken by a bone-chilling shriek. I jumped out of bed and opened my door. There stood Jason, hovering above a small rat whose lower body was stuck to a glue trap in my kitchen. The one above the bathroom had apparently worn himself out, as the noise had been reduced to sporadic soft thumps. I called and made an appointment for the dude, who now pretty much hated me, to come to my apartment during my 11 o'clock break, as had become routine. Jason and I sat on the couch, sipping coffee, silently staring across the room as my newest captive gnawed frantically at his own legs. The exterminator, with the help of my helmet, plucked the trap hosting the matted, near-dead rat from the vent and placed it face down on top of the other trap, making a grotesque double patty wrap sandwich, which he then swept into a plastic bag. As he replaced traps and tossed out some more poison, I noticed that the bag was still moving, and I could hear a faint whimpering. I just couldn't let it go on. I retreated to my balcony and returned with a cinder block. Don't ask me why I had a cinder block. And I proceeded to smash the bag repeatedly, manic, until all noise and movement ceased. I stood to see the final look I would ever receive from my exterminator, one of pure horror. I shrugged, wiped the sweat off my brow, escorted the exterminator to the door, and took a long, hot crying game shower. The next day, my landlord finally showed up with workmen to cover up the hole in my kitchen. And the remainder of my residence went by without incident, unless you count the awful nightmares that yanked me from sleep, trembling and sweating at least 4 nights a week for the next 3 months. 2 weeks before I was to move out, I heard the familiar scratching noise in that same corner above my couch. The apartment next door had just had a change of tenants. Ever the dutiful neighbor, I knocked on the door to apartment 207. A Korean woman about my age answered the door. I offered her a sad smile and extended my welcome gift. You might need this. She looked down at my hands and then looked back into my face, utterly confused. I nodded, and she tentatively plucked the bag of rat poison out of my hands. I smiled sympathetically and bowed. Joan haru deseo.